As I mentioned earlier, we are very privileged today to have with us Dr. David Carlson, who is our guest preacher for the day. Dr. Carlson is a professor of English literature at Cal State University, San Bernardino, and he is also a friend and a parishioner as well, because he is a member of Emmanuel United Methodist Church. Dr. Carlson is a world-class scholar, and among other things that he has published, he is the author of a book called Sovereign Selves, which deals with American Indian autobiography, and he's a specialist in the literatures of the Native American cultures. And this is Native American Ministries Sunday here in our church and in the denomination as a whole. And you may have noticed in your bulletin you have a special offering envelope that allows you to give to this fund of the United Methodist Church, which reaches out into the Native American communities around the country. As you know, there have been instances in our own city lately where we witness the lack of inclusiveness and, flat-out racism that still exists in many places within our world and in our community. There can be no mistake that the United Methodist Church goes on record as saying that this is one world for all of us. This is one community and one church in which everyone is invited to be a part. And so we reach out into all communities, all segments of the community around the country and around the world, to make sure that we are ministering where people are hurting and where there are needs. So this offering that we raise today reaches into Native American communities to address needs in that community, but more specifically, it helps to educate Native Americans who are called to ministry in the United Methodist Church, those who feel that they are called to pastoral ministry. And so seminary costs for Native Americans are underwritten by this fund as well. So I hope many of you will consider giving, along with your regular tithes and offering, a special gift to Native American Ministry Sunday. So as I said before, our guest speaker he is an authority on many aspects of Native American culture. I didn't ask him specifically to address that, but he just may, just because of his area of specialty. But I've asked him to come and bring us a word from the Lord. And we're welcoming and proud to say good morning and welcome again to Dr. David Carlson.
Thank you for having me today. Can you hear me okay? I'm trying to get the mic the right level. Okay. I want to thank Hilly for inviting me. I want to thank you for having me here to speak today. This is the first, actually, strangely enough, this is the first time I've been to this church, which is odd since I go to a church that's just a few miles from here. It's a lovely church, and you should be very proud of it. I think what I'm going to give you today is something probably halfway between a sermon and a class lecture. I hope you'll sort of go along with me on that. And it seems appropriate since half my students are sitting in the back of the room, which is kind of what I'm sort of used to. This is like a big lecture hall. It's sort of funny. And I think I am going to talk a bit about some of the things that Hilly had to say a second ago, but I'm going to hit them from a slightly different direction. And I hope you'll bear with me if I seem like I'm taking you down an alternate path for a bit. Okay. When I was preparing to speak today, I was reminded of some words written by Samson Occam, who was an 18th century Mohican Indian minister in the Congregationalist Church. And I actually teach about him regularly in my college courses. He wrote a brief autobiography in 1768, and in that autobiography, he talks about how poorly he was treated, actually, in the Christian community of New England at that time. He comments, for example, about how much financial support he was given for his ministry. He was given about 8% of the support given to white ministers in the same synod at the time. And he was also asked to do a lot more than they were. He had to ride circuit over hundreds of miles to reach Indian communities to preach. He was even publicly chastised for not caring well enough for his horse when his horse died under the strain of that labor. He was publicly reprimanded by the church for not caring for his horse. And he also draws attention to how he was employed as a fundraiser touring England on behalf of the Congregationalist Church without that effort really translating back into his home Mohegan community. Just briefly, he was sent to England to raise money to create an Indian college in Mohegan Country, which is in Connecticut. He raised thousands and thousands of pounds sterling, which is a lot of money in that time, came back, and his mentor took that money and founded Dartmouth College, which, as you know, is not in Connecticut. It's in New Hampshire. The first class at Dartmouth College, when it opened in 1770, had 4 American Indian students who dropped out rather rapidly, and Dartmouth did not have another Indian student until 1970 after that. Now, okay, enough about that. Occam realized, I think, in writing his autobiography that there was something admittedly awkward, maybe even impolite, about digressing from what he was supposed to be doing in a spiritual autobiography, which was telling the uplifting story of his conversion to the Christian faith, which was a sincere conversion experience. And instead, offering some pointed criticism of his fellow Christians. But he found a biblical parallel on which he could draw, the often equally impolite St. Paul. I speak like a fool, Occam wrote in his text, but I am constrained. And what he's doing here is echoing Paul's words in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, where Paul is starting off on a bit of a diatribe against some of the false apostles that he was competing with in ministry. And he writes at the beginning of this, "Would to God you could bear with me a little in my folly," recognizing that people aren't going to want to hear what he has to say. St. Paul knew, like Occam did, that a critical message, even a justified one, often strikes an audience as out of place, maybe even a little uncouth. But both also knew that sometimes one is constrained by the Spirit moving within you to say what's in your heart. Okay, now that I've scared you a little bit, let me offer you some reassurance. I'm not preparing to be an angry St. Paul here, and I'm not planning to criticize anyone in the sanctuary, but I am going to speak occasionally like a fool today, because I feel constrained to do so, and because I think that the United Methodist Church is sort of missing the point, the way we describe and observe Native American Ministries Sunday. But I want to frame this idea in relation to today's gospel reading from Luke. Let me remind everyone of 2 particular passages from what we just read. First, verses 13 through 16. Now the same day, 2 of them were going to the village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that happened, and as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus came up and walked along them, but they were kept from recognizing him. The second, at the end, verses 30 to 32, when he was at table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" It seems to me there's 2 basic points being made in this part of Luke's gospel. Points that relate directly to the way Christian churches in general, not just the United Methodist Church, have tended to interact with Indian people. Luke's story reminds us, first of all, that it can be very difficult to recognize the presence of God, especially when that presence manifests itself in places where we're not expecting it to find it, or in people who don't look or act or have a culture that appears like ours on the surface. The travelers in Luke's story were not expecting to find Jesus on the road to Emmaus, and so they couldn't see him, even when he was right in front of them. Now, this isn't so unlike the way many European and European American Christians have regularly throughout our history seen or maybe failed to see indigenous Americans. James West, who's a Southern Cheyenne Baptist minister and co-founder of the American Indian Baptist Caucus, describes the problematic legacy of how Christians have tended to missionize Indian people this way. This is a quote from him. "The conversion ethic has been expressed in a political, social, economic, and spiritual theory called manifest destiny in regards to the discovery and conquest of the New World. This theory, simply put, states that God has destined the Christian world to conquer the rest of creation in his name, and within this context, the spiritual conversion of Indian people is related to social, economic, and political conversion." If I can refer back to Samson Occam again a minute ago, his mentor, a minister named Eliezer Wheelock, the guy who sent him to England to raise money for Dartmouth College, wrote about the conversion experience or the process of missionizing American Indians, that the first goal was to make Indians Englishmen, and the second goal was to make them Christians. And I think that's sort of interesting when you think about it in those terms. Now, West, and I want you to remember her, this is a Christian Indian. This is a member of the Baptist Church who's writing this. So this is someone who's in the Christian community making this point about this history. When he points out that there's a long and disturbing history of how the Christian faith has been employed as a mechanism not just for spiritual uplift, but for, frankly, the colonization and oppression of Indian peoples. And he's also drawing attention to how that conversion work has been built often around a wide-ranging rejection of differences between people within the faith community. Now, you can invite me back after church for an after-church talk to talk about this. I could give you lots of examples, but I don't want to do that here. Because conversion to the Christian faith has often been understood as a complete transformation of the Indian person, inside and outside, into essentially a European person, Christians have often been just as blind to those travelers as those travelers on the road to Emmaus, just as unable to see signs of God or the Holy Spirit in traditional Indian societies. And we've also tended historically to set before our Indian brethren an either-or choice. You can be part of Christianity as we understand it and practice it, or you can be part of the traditions and heritage of your own people. Now, some have accepted that choice, of course, but many Christian Indians have ended up in a position where they conceal a great deal of the complexity of their spiritual relationship to Christ and to God from other members of their denominations. The official United Methodist Church website talks about Native American Ministries Sunday, and it has a frequently asked questions section. And it includes this question: do Native Christians worship differently than other Christians? And the answer that our denomination gives us is primarily no. This is a quote from the website. Native American Methodists believe in the theology and polity of the United Methodist Church. In visiting a United Methodist Native congregation, you would find many similarities. What differences we would find, we're told, are deemed largely superficial ones. There might be the inclusion of traditional elements in worship. There might be praying or singing in an Indian language. There might be the use of traditional instruments, maybe a bit more emphasis on spontaneous prayer. But there's no real complicating differences being presented here. Christianization, we're told, has brought our Indian brothers and sisters toward us in a way that's very comfortable. And I hope you'll forgive me for speaking a little bit like a fool here, but something about this official picture rings false to me, or at least superficial. Now, while I don't doubt there are many, many, many things that link Indian and non-Indian Methodists together, it seems to me that we do ourselves and our Indian brothers and sisters a disservice by pretending that conversion obliterates differences. Don't take my word for this, though. Let me quote you the words of a woman named Tweety Sombrero, who is a Navajo pastor of the Garfield Indian United Methodist Church in Phoenix, Arizona. Sombrero, she's written about her experience as a Methodist in an essay that she called Two Paths. And this piece turns on the central role in her own faith journey of her paternal grandfather, a man named Nahi Man, who was a traditional Navajo medicine man and spiritual leader. From a young age, Sombrero recalls that Nahi Man schooled her in the traditions, ceremonial practices, and stories of her Navajo community. And this included things like getting up every morning at daybreak and running up into the mountains as a way of greeting the Creator and showing that we are energetic participants in the work of creation. Now, when Sombrero graduated from college, and this is where she was first introduced to Methodism, she indicated that she was interested in entering the seminary. and she turned to her grandfather again for advice. What was she to do? Should she convert to Christianity? What would that mean for her? Nali Man told her that she would always have two paths before her in her life, and that the choice of path should always be informed by a series of lessons. Lesson one, he said, is to always live in wonder at the sacred path of the Creator, a point that he reinforced to her by taking her into the canyons around her home for hours to talk about trees, rocks, insects, sky, cloud, all things that Sombrero herself says are a part of me. The second lesson is to pray throughout your life and to be constantly thankful for what happens to you, whatever it is. The third and final lesson is to give of yourself always, to show the Creator that you are using what has been bestowed upon you. Now, hearing this again, this is what she's hearing from the traditional Navajo medicine man, spiritual leader. Right? This should sound familiar to us, though, I think. Hearing this, Sombrero told her grandfather that she wanted to be a minister, a choice that he then validated by singing to her part of the Blessing Way, which is a traditional Navajo ceremony that I think if I sang that to you today, many of you would hear this and think that's paganism, not Christianity. I think we have to see here that conversion for Tweety Sombrero is really a much more complicated thing than it first appears. The two paths before her never totally diverge. And when Nali Man says, you will always have two paths before you, I think what he means is that both your Navajo life and your Christian life will always be there, co-present with one another. And indeed, was it not Sombrero's Navajo faith, the lessons given to her by a traditional medicine man, that led her to the Christian ministry? And is it not striking that her written account of her Christian journey is built on the validation of a culture and traditions that historically many Christians have called pagan? Can we be confident then in claiming that Tweety Sombrero worships the same way that we do? And what if she doesn't? Is that bad? Perhaps if we let go of the need to diminish the differences between her Christian journey and ours, we might make something more of Native American Ministries Day than it is right now. We might use it as a spur to seek out more chances to reflect on how alternate experiences of God and Christ within a wide range of cultural contexts and complementary beliefs can enhance all of our spiritual lives. This leads me, incidentally, to the other thing that I have to say does bother me about the way our denomination frames this particular day. Okay, and here's a little more fool talk for you. On the webpage I just mentioned, here's some text that sets out why this day exists on the church calendar. Here's what our church tells us, and I'm quoting again. What makes Native people special? Within the body of Christ, every person, every culture has unique gifts to refresh the church. The contributions of Native people as individuals and groups are not more important than the contributions of other Christians. Native people, however, are among the poorest and most marginalized of society and also the church. The unfortunate fact is that people without power, the power of wealth or social status, tend to be overlooked. Now, I realize this is well-intended, everyone, and that there's some validity to this. But again, the fool feels like he needs to point out a couple of things here. First of all, not all American Indian people are poor. And even those who would be labeled poor in statistical terms, in terms of wealth and social status, would not label themselves as such, particularly in spiritual terms. Second, to frame Indian people as marginalized implies that the ultimate goal is their full integration into non-Indian society. Now, to me, that sounds a little bit like the conversion as assimilation model I talked about before. I think what Tweety Sombrero wants and needs from the Methodist Church is something a bit different and a bit more challenging than being moved from the Indian margin to the non-Indian center. She wants to be respected as someone who doesn't want to leave one of her paths behind to walk fully on the other one. And finally, to imply that poverty is the reason that Indian people are special enough to warrant a day on the calendar, and in particular a special offering, is, quite frankly, demeaning. Surely there are other ways to raise consciousness about issues of social justice, public health, self-determination, respectful treatment within the church that don't involve perpetuating damaging stereotypes. Surely there's something else that could be happening or on or around a Native American Ministry Sunday something that involves actually listening to and learning from the experiences of our Christian Indian brothers and sisters instead of offering them well-intentioned pity. I just don't hear the voices and perspectives of the Indian people I know in this official pronouncement from the church. And I strongly believe that no church can celebrate Native Christians or enter into ministry with them by talking down to them. We can only do so by learning to better listen to them. Now this brings me back again to Luke's gospel. So here you're getting some sermon again, not just lecturing. To the second point I want to draw from it. The road to Emmaus story shows us that the process of recognizing and valuing the sacredness of difference demands of us that we listen deeply and carefully to others, and that we set aside our presumptions that we have superior knowledge or perspective on whatever problem we confront. Notice how our walkers on the road presume that they know everything about Jesus' ministry and resurrection, a sense of certainty that contributes to their inability to see Christ right in front of them, and which leads them to be incredulous that this mysterious traveler they encounter can be so ignorant of this story that they know so well. But also notice how at the end, they come to realize that if they had really been listening, deeply listening with their hearts as their minds, they would have known Christ more fully all along, and not just at the end when he revealed himself to them. They would have deepened their faith and their understanding even more in that moment of encounter. So what might happen to us as United Methodists if we were to use Native American Ministries Day, Sunday, not as an occasion just as a special offering, but also as an opportunity to listen carefully to what Christian Indians can teach us about the Bible, about Christ, and about God? Let me give you one example here, which I want to use to close my message for today. Rosemary McCombs Maxey is Muskogee Creek from Oklahoma originally, and she serves as the pastor of the Mount Tabor United Church of Christ in Rocky Ridge, Maryland. Like many Christian Indians whose works I've read or whom I've spoken with, Maxey's understanding of Christian teaching is deeply informed by her traditional heritage. Conversion to the Christian faith for her, as with Sombrero, did not involve a repudiation of her Indian life and traditions, but rather an enriching combination of two paths, two roads. In that context, here's how Maxey reads the beginning of Genesis, the creation story. Quoting from her, "The stories of many tribal nations are not unlike the Genesis account. We are created from earth, made last, not as a hierarchical culmination, but in a more humble position. The human being is considered the weakest of creation, entirely dependent on all the other created forms for mere existence. Gratitude, nurture, and equality are to be accorded to all of creation." Now, I'm not sure about you all, but to me, that's actually kind of an unusual way to read Genesis, and I think a thought-provoking and profound way to read Genesis. In the church traditions that I was raised in, we tended to focus on man being created last as a sign of supremacy, of dominion, right? And we focus on the elements of Genesis that support such a reading. But I'm really taken by Maxey's interpretation here, one that's clearly informed by her Creek Indian upbringing. I appreciate the spirit of humility it stresses. I appreciate the way it encourages us to see ourselves as interconnected with the created world. Stewardship of the earth is a concept that resonates for me from my own tradition, but it means something a little different for Maxey, and I feel like I'm enriched by hearing her version of what stewardship might be. So listening to the different kind of Christian witness coming from this Creek Church of Christ minister then, again, enriches me profoundly. And I think that enrichment might be a little bit like the way that hearing those hidden words of Christ made those hearts burn on the road to Emmaus. When I think of the experiences of people like Tweety Sombrero or Rosemary McCombs Maxey, then I can't think of them as poor or marginal. These are voices I want to hear more of, voices we need to actively seek out and listen to, both in their similarities and differences from our own faith journeys. And that's the kind of Indian mission work I believe we need to encourage in the United Methodist Church. And I don't want to suggest that it doesn't happen, but I think particularly if we're going to have one day on the church calendar per year to really focus on this, I think we really need to focus on that. Native American Ministries Day is an occasion to invite the Spirit of God as it has manifested itself in indigenous communities into our own lives and to learn from that Spirit. And the more we can do that, the less foolish talk we'll need to have together. I want to thank you again for asking me to speak today, and I'd like us to invite God's blessing on all people who seek to know him, whatever paths or roads they are walking. Amen.